I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Kyiv and the world waits with bated breath for the results of the US presidential election, we look at the situation on the battlefield as Moscow seeks to strengthen its foothold. And later hear more about how ordinary Russians view the conflict.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 5th of November, 2 years and 261 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and our man in Moscow, James Kilner. But first, to Dom, for the latest news from the battlefield.
OK, let's look inside the country. A Russian attack on the city of Zaporizhia this morning killed at least 6, injured at least 16. That comes from Governor Ivan Fedorov. Now, authorities warned about a possible ballistic missile strike just after 9 o'clock this morning. And then shortly after that, several explosions were reported across the city. Now, that comes at the end of a relatively quiet 24-hour period in terms of casualties yesterday. Russia did launch 79 drones last night. You remember yesterday I spoke about quite what's happening at the moment in drones. And I said yesterday over the weekend there were, I think, 274 drones fired. So 79 last night, still a very large number, but they're not doing an awful lot of damage, thankfully. So 79 drones last night, as well as guided bombs and 2 Kh-59/69 variant aerial missiles. Both of those missiles were shot down over Odessa. Now, Ukrainian air defences shot down 48 of the 79 drones, brought down over 8 regions of Ukraine. 30 other drones lost due to EW, and 1 headed off back to Russia. That comes from Ukraine's Air Force. Glide bombs hit the city of Kharkiv again, as we talked about yesterday. The Kutsarub community in Mykolaiv Oblast was attacked 4 times with first-person view drones. Governor Vitaly Kim reported that on Telegraph. Now, no casualties reported from those FPV strikes in Mykolaiv, but if that is an extension of the so-called human safari war that Russia's been waging against civilians in Kherson, we've talked about before, that is a very worrying trend and one that we will obviously track closely. Now, outside of the country, connected, very interesting aftermath of the Moldovan election, which Roland covered on Monday. Just a quick reminder, Western-leaning Maya Sandu won by 10 points. She won 55% to 45% over the Kremlin-friendly opponent Alexander Stoyanoglu. Now, she was behind as the count from the country came in on Sunday. I was tracking this. Votes in the country, as they were counted, she was behind, and then she sort of caught up. She rapidly moved into the lead when the diaspora vote was counted, i.e. those Moldovans outside the country who have the right to participate in the electoral process. OK, so she then won by 10 clear points. As expected, Russian-affiliated commentators cried foul, many pointing to shadowy European bureaucrats who were apparently behind the whole thing. I mean, my very limited knowledge, we need to get Joe Barnes on, but my very limited knowledge of European bureaucracy is that they could not organise in a brewery, let alone rig an election. But there we go, European bureaucrats apparently behind the whole thing. The Moldovan Socialist Party called Ms. Sandu an illegitimate president, but they didn't explain why. Then Kremlin-affiliated Moldovan oligarch Ilan Shor told Russian state TV channel Rossiya 24 that the Moldovan opposition has evidence of mass vote falsifications in favour of Sandu, but they didn't actually provide any evidence to back that claim up. And then pro-Kremlin former Moldovan President Igor Dodon told Russian state media outlet TASS that Sandu only won because of the Moldovan diaspora vote. Now, that might be correct. That's how Moldovan democracy works, and democracy in many other places, as they well know, and as they would defend, has the result gone their way, of course. I note today that Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said of Ms. Sandu, she is not, as far as we understand, the president of her country, because in the country itself, the majority of the population did not vote for her. I mean, it's willful. It is willful, and it's so childish. It would be amusing and worthy of being immediately ignored were it not so serious, and a window into the Kremlin soul when it comes to governance and how we humans organise themselves. Change the rules if you don't like it. Change. Moldova can vote. Change the rules. Don't have external votes if you don't want to. Only allow people with a D in their name to vote if you want to. But yeah, it's your country. You set the rules. Now, continuing this theme, last night, as we reported yesterday, or in anticipation of yesterday, thousands of Georgians gathered in the centre of Tbilisi to protest the pro-Russian Georgian Dream Party's victory in that country's presidential election 10 days ago. The opposition outlined three main goals for the protest movement. They said they want to continue to collect evidence demonstrating, in their view, how the elections were not free and fair. Secondly, they're urging the international community not to acknowledge the election results and recognise the Georgian Dream's victory. And number three, they want to continue, or they're saying they're going to continue to practice their right to assemble and resist the results. They said there's going to be regular protests and repeated their call, firstly, for international investigations into the alleged election falsification, and secondly, for snap elections to be held administered by external international bodies. We'll keep a light touch on that. Okay, next one. Google has been accused by Ukrainian defence chiefs of accidentally revealing the location of key military positions following an update to its Maps tool. So Andrei Kovalenko, who's the head of Ukraine's counter-disinformation unit at the National Security Council, expressed anger at what he viewed as the tech giant's irresponsibility after military sites were exposed on Google Maps, the navigational tool that freely provides users with satellite imagery, aerial pictures, etc., etc. I use Google Maps all the time just before mangling the Ukrainian village names for you. Anyway, in one instance of Google's apparent slip-up here, new air defence systems near Kyiv were identified as US-made Patriot anti-aircraft missiles from a Google satellite photo dated September the 28th last year. They were missing in an earlier Google satellite photograph. Mr. Kovalenko, speaking on Telegram, said, "Imagine the situation. Google displays updated images of maps showing the location of our military systems. We are contacting them to fix it quickly. The Russians are already actively dispersing these pictures. What is wrong with the world?" Well, I mean, that last bit, Mr. Kovalenko, that's a big question, I'm afraid. As for the first bit, I think there's a hint of performance management going on here. I mean, look, Google is no friend of the Kremlin. Look how last week the Kremlin fined Google 2 undecillion rubles. Right, that is a 2 followed by 36 zeros. Okay, that is more money than there is in the entire world. A load of old Balkans. So, as I say, I think this is all continuing a bit of a theme. As Simon W. from Objective Ukraine, the in-country security and risk management firm, says, Ukrainian defence chief will have long ago worked out the risk from commercially available satellite imagery and be aware of what overhead, in the terminology, non-air breathing assets, i.e. satellites, Russia and China have probably got on a geosynchronous orbit staring at Ukraine right now. So the idea that Google's revealed all this stuff is probably for the birds. As for the locations themselves, I'm sure people in Ukraine will know where they are, where these missiles and all the other things are, because they'll either see them or they'll see the launches of the anti-air missiles and work out where the missiles came from. And there are probably enough Russian spies wandering around noting such information down. Okay, so I think it's a little bit sort of hissy going on here. But for me, of more interest is the fact that we've still got stories of security teams giving away locations of their principals through fitness apps like Strava. Don't know if you saw this, but last week, members of the GSPR, the French equivalent of the US Secret Service, revealed President Macron's location and movements. News outlet Le Monde was able to identify the names and addresses of a dozen of the French president's bodyguards by tracking jogging routes they'd used on reconnaissance trips to scout hotels President Macron would be staying at. Same story a few years ago in West Africa for US Department of Defense personnel. So, there's genuine stuff out there. Smart technology can be used by security agencies or counterintelligence agencies to work out some interesting stuff. I don't think a commercially available product such as Google Maps is really... it's in the shallow end. It's in the shallow end of giving the game away. But anyway, I think they're making a bit too much of it, which I may be as well. And then just finally for me, Francis, you'll be particularly interested in this, I think. The latest edition of Russia's FSB Security Service annual calendar is out. Features a very buff Putin and President 11 standing side by side. There's lots of tight black T-shirts, rippling pecs, biceps that could crack a walnut. Well, folks, if you think Francis's picture byline on the Telegraph website has been a little generous to the years, wait until you see the artist's impression of Putin. He looks about 40 years younger, although somehow he's ended up with a giant Pac-Man ghost stenciled on his forehead. I've tweeted that out a little while ago. Go and have a look. It is a bit bizarre. Now, the drawing for January 2025 shows a strong and noble-looking knight wearing the Russian flag, slaying a far weaker footman wearing a tunic bearing the flags of Ukraine, the EU, Poland, Britain, the US, and a rainbow flag. Putin being an avowed opponent of LGBTQ plus rights, despite appearing in one of the most homoerotic calendars the world has ever known. Anyway, do go and have a look. It's all very good fun. A stocking filler or stockings filler, fishnet or otherwise, should you so wish. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Thanks, Dom. I shudder to think what a Telegraph calendar would be. You naked with your bits and bobs covered by a small microphone, perhaps. If so, it would need to be a charity calendar, I think. There's no way the public would buy it otherwise. But anyway, on to serious matters. Today is undoubtedly one of the most important days of the war, frankly. Almost 10,000 kilometres away from Ukraine, how the United States chooses to vote in its presidential election today will have huge ramifications, not only for the direction of the conflict, but for the defence posture of the West itself. We will be covering it in full this week and have some great guests lined up. But for now, it's the calm before the storm. And there's no use speculating about what polling suggests the outcome likely to be at this moment, only what each result would mean. A Trump victory, of course, would likely see an attempt to impose some kind of peace treaty on Ukraine at the threat of a withdrawal of military support, whilst a Democratic victory would likely see a continuation of the current levels of military and financial aid to Kyiv. But more fundamentally, the evidence suggests if Trump wins, we will see a profound tilt in the priorities of the United States, with a Republican victory likely to mean a deprioritising of the European theatre in favour of the Pacific, despite the fact that countries in the Pacific like Japan, Taiwan, South Korea are ironically becoming even more concerned about what a Russian victory in Europe would mean for them. Had certain other decisions been made in Europe in the past 3 years, the next 24 hours or so might not seem so potentially seismic. If Germany, France, Britain, all those other European powers had really ramped up their military spending following the full-scale invasion, we might be in a situation now where, at least in the short term, Europe would be able to fill gaps in terms of weapons and material for Kyiv if the US decided to withdraw. But that is not the reality. Those of you who've been with us over the past year or so will have sensed how the wider West has effectively decided to wait and see what the US election result will be before adapting their strategies accordingly. A pretty insane approach from the position of many defence experts, which I'll come to. But it is worth considering the twin dilemma that faces Europe. If it arms, the US may think it needs to do less because Europe has matters under its own control. If it doesn't, then new officials in Washington, whoever they are, could think Europe isn't doing enough and call it out far more vocally or worse. So Europe is sort of damned if it does or damned if it doesn't. But that, I think for many, including myself, I should say, doesn't excuse the insufficient activities that have been adopted in recent months. Only Poland and the Baltic nations have really responded in the way that matches the level of severity, many would argue. And indeed, the promised deliveries of military defence, particularly from Germany and others, has not really lived up, at least in terms of its own armament, to what was promised 3 years ago. Now, the urgency of the situation can be felt by a new public letter signed by names that will be familiar to many of you listening at home, including Professor Elliot Cohen, former head of the United States Air Force, David A. Deptula, Professor Hugh Strawn of the University of St Andrews, Mick Ryan, Commandant of the Australian Defence College, Air Marshal Edward Stringer, Lord Dannatt, Chief of the General Staff British Army, Professor Phillips O'Brien of St Andrews, Dr Benjamin Tallis, Dr Mike Martin, Terry Virts, NASA astronaut, just some names that will be familiar to you who have signed this. It has over 100 signatures and is too long to read in full, but I'll read a few excerpts to give you a flavour. For nearly 1,000 days, Ukraine has resisted full-scale Russian aggression. The heroism of its armed forces and its people stand as an example to all free nations. But Ukraine and its allies face a twin strategic danger now. The first is that an incoming Trump administration will attempt to impose a deal with Russia detrimental to Ukraine's interests and to European security. This would leave Kyiv adrift from NATO and the EU in a condition of fake neutrality, and Europe with a destabilising geopolitical grey zone in the heart of the continent. The second is that an incoming Harris administration will continue with the policies of stasis and red lines, which have to date withheld the capabilities with which Ukraine could win the war. In this scenario, the fatalism of key European governments who refuse to believe Ukraine can win and are tempted to commit, at best, only to bolstering of NATO defence in response to a Ukrainian defeat could mean decisive defeat within the alliance, damaging its credibility. In both cases, the parallels with the 1938 Munich Agreement are clear. It would be a false peace achieved through European acquiescence in the dismembering of a sovereign state, and would leave that state unable to defend itself against future aggression, while buying an unacceptably small amount of time for our own rearmament. It would be likely to lead to a wider and even more destructive war. The signatories of this appeal, which is being circulated privately among policymakers in the NATO alliance, are convinced that a third course is possible, which can lead to Europe's survival as a prominent power and Russia's defeat. This is not only the right thing to do, it is the best way to secure Europe in the short term and buy ourselves time. Our belief is premised on 5 grounds. 1. The inevitability of Russia prevailing is a myth. Russia cannot sustain its war effort at current levels beyond 2025. 2. There is no credible plan for Ukrainian or European security after any ceasefire. The Putin regime has demonstrated time and again that it is not a credible negotiating partner and that it cannot be trusted to keep any deal that it signs. 3. Failing to win endangers all European allies. A Minsk III agreement, reached in full knowledge that it was the failure of Western willpower that obligated it, would neither guarantee Ukraine's stability nor enhance the security of its European neighbours. To the contrary, demographic models suggest it would create a new refugee crisis in Europe. 4. The route to Ukrainian victory still exists. This is well understood in defence ministries across European NATO states. Using new military technology, we can quickly leverage Europe's industrial capacity to build the capabilities Ukraine needs to disable Russia's war machine. For example, building a massed precision strike force for Ukraine, with no external restrictions on its targeting, is within our grasp. And 5. Those who want to act can. The means to victory do not require sign-off at the level of the 32-country NATO alliance, but can be provided by a coalition of willing powers, including all those committed to Ukraine's recovery of its current occupied territory and then providing Kyiv with real security guarantees. So that's the essence of the letter. For what's little it's worth, I completely agree with that analysis. Now, in other news, I mentioned Poland a moment ago. It's worth saying that while Poland is perhaps the nation most aware of what a victory for Russia would mean, there are still tensions. Its Deputy Prime Minister has alleged President Zelensky wants Poland to shoot missiles down over Ukraine, which, he says, means he wants Poland to enter the war, which means he wants Poland to be at war with Russia. That's a direct quote there. This is in response to the argument that Kyiv has put forward that it wants to see Western missiles shooting down Russian missiles over Ukrainian territory. But of course, from Kyiv's perspective, it's hardly surprising they would argue that. Poland is, from their perspective, already effectively at war with Russia, whether it acknowledges or not. So what is the difference? But again, it speaks to a difference in mentality with regards to what is really going on, I think. Lastly, I just wanted to comment on a story in the Wall Street Journal about Western security officials saying now they believe that the 2 incendiary devices shipped via DHL that we reported on were in part a covert Russian operation aimed to start fires aboard cargo or passenger aircraft flying to the US and Canada. This is all part of that sabotage campaign against Washington and its allies we've been discussing. They, of course, ignited those packages, one in Leipzig and one in Birmingham here in England. If true, it would speak to just the degree to which Moscow sees itself as I say, already fighting a war against the wider West. But also, more fundamentally, Russia arguably becoming increasingly reliant on criminal networks and lone wolf individuals to continue its aims. In many ways, it wants to be strategically reckless as part of its pillar of its strategy. And this would, of course, whilst risking bringing in the US even deeper into the war, the fact is it operates in a way that thinks itself as being deniable in the activities because it can blame rogue wolves, rogue operatives, etc. Just look at what happened with MH17. So an interesting story, and one we need to keep returning to, because if there were such an incident, it would have huge ramifications if indeed the finger was pointed at Moscow. So that's where we are in the political realm. But let's stay with Russia for this bit. I'm delighted to welcome back our man on the Moscow desk, James Kilner. Now, James, we heard from you last week about your experience at the BRICS summit, a really fascinating perspective you offered there. And we said we would return to you for your thoughts on the conversations that you had whilst you were in Russia, including with a tweed jacket wearing FSB officer. But before we get to that, a couple of other stories you've been covering for us, including one about a Russian manual that teaches soldiers how to construct mass graves. But where do you want to start, James Kilner?
Hi, Francis. Before we get going on the mass grave story, I think it's important because Dom was talking about it. I got a response from Google this morning. I wrote the story that Dom was talking about, the Google images apparently giving away location of some Ukrainian air defense systems yesterday. And Google responded this morning. So I think for your listeners, if you don't mind, I'm just going to take 30 seconds to read out Google's response. A Google spokesman said, "These satellite images were taken more than a year ago and come from widely available sources. We intentionally do not publish recent imagery of conflict areas." On the complaints from Ukraine, the Google spokesman said, "We take requests like this very seriously and are in touch with Ukrainian officials." So for balance and to give Google their say in the matter, I think that was an important interjection. On the story about the mass graves, this is a manual that has apparently been distributed to Russian soldiers last month. It was reported by Russian language Telegram channels over the weekend. I picked up the story. This was an updated version, apparently, of a 2021 manual produced by Russia's emergencies ministry. 20-page textbook with black and white, rather crude black and white pictures showing what appears to be body bags in a massive grave and then a digger piling up earth over it, that sort of thing. Sort of Soviet bureaucratic in style. There's lots of tables giving details about the number of man hours it was going to take to dig a big grave, or the sort of the amount of chemicals that were needed to sanitize these graves, this sort of thing. The main focus, we're talking about mass graves for 100 bodies, quite serious in style and size. And obviously this comes at a time when, as we've been reporting regularly, Francis, Russian soldiers on the front line are sustaining about 1,200 casualties every day. That doesn't mean 1,200 people dead. That means 1,200 people killed or badly injured, basically out of action. They've been sustaining these casualty numbers since about May time. Prior to that, they were on about 900 a day. So a remarkable number of casualties they're sustaining. It is really important to make the point here that I have not seen any reports so far of Russian soldiers using mass graves to bury their own war dead. But I have seen a report occupied from Russian-controlled parts of Donbass where at least one mass grave for 20 bodies was used to bury local soldiers enlisted into local militia groups and fighting alongside Russians. So this is happening. It's a very macabre turn of events, I'd say, in what has become a brutal war of attrition. An important story, and one which really illustrates the point about Russia and the Russian army losing so many men on the front line. Moving on to my trip to Kazan. So I was last in Kazan in 2018, just before the Football World Cup, which really gives you a perspective on how far Russia has shifted from being seen as an accepted part of the international community, even after its 2014 initial invasion of Ukraine. In 2018, it was hosting this massive World Cup. I think England were at one point meant to be playing a football match in Kazan, but I'm not sure it happened in the end. But I was there to help report on Kazan as a destination place for English football fans. I think I was also there in Kazan in 2009. I used to live in Russia, and I was on a trip in 2009 and went through Kazan as well. It's a good looking city, lovely Kremlin built on the confluence of two rivers, one of them the Volga, rather impressive Soviet and Tsarist architecture. It has a good vibe, considering Russia and Russians. In that perspective, it is considered to some extent to be Russia's third city after Moscow and St. Petersburg. So it's a big city, 7 million people live there. Before I went, one of my sources living in another Russian city had warned me that Kazan also has the reputation of being a hardcore Z city, hardcore supporter of the war in Ukraine. As you know, that Z has become a symbol of pro-war sentiment in Russia. Mobilization or recruitment numbers, rather, from Tatarstan, the region that Kazan is capital of, 4 of their battalions that they've sent off, that they've raised and sent off Ukraine, are quite high. And the Kremlin has positioned its shiny new drone factory in Kazan. So definitely has a reputation of being a sort of pro-war city. When I turned up, as you say, I was there for the BRICS summit. I did have 2 days after the BRICS summit, wandering around trying to talk to people very discreetly and to try and get a sense of how people considered the war and Vladimir Putin. This was a very, very rare trip by a UK newspaper correspondent to Russia since the start of the war. I was certainly the only UK newspaper reporter in Kazan at the time. It's one of those sort of through the looking glass moments where it felt like a normal city going about its normal business. There was clearly a lot of tourists from other parts of Russia. Much harder to leave Russia these days. Flight options are very expensive and limited, etc. So domestic tourism has increased, and Kazan is definitely a Russian tourist destination. So, like I was saying earlier, there's generally a relatively relaxed vibe in the city. But throughout my stay there, the little indications of war going on several hundred miles away in Ukraine were all there. There were posters for recruitment, military recruitment, offering $20,000 signing on bonus, which is a huge amount of money. There were little adverts in shop windows offering discounts to military veterans. One end of the main pedestrian street in Kazan, there was a large exhibition about the war. It had photographs of local soldiers who'd been awarded medals of bravery, that sort of thing. It had a diagram explaining how you could defeat a US Abrams tank. And it had, on one end of it as well, and I was watching children and some adults do this, there was a picture of a Russian soldier with his face cut out, and these children or some adults could stick their head through the photo of the soldier and have their photograph taken and pretend to be that soldier. So, I mean, sort of indoctrination and indication that war was going on the borders. There was even the odd Z slogan car bumper sticker I saw. But in amongst all this sort of relatively relaxed vibe, these sort of war indications, I was able to speak to quite a few people, and relatively easily, more easily than I expected, people who were very skeptical about what Putin's been doing, not just to the war, but in regards to Russia generally, which is an important point to make, but also about his war in Ukraine. It was very easy to find people who supported the war in Ukraine, and then they came out with the usual trope that NATO pushed Russia into it and Vladimir Putin had no choice, etc., etc. But then you could also find people more candidly who would say, you know, I've always been against the war. There's bodies of mounting up. I know that the Russian TV is lying. I meet veterans who tell me it's far worse than you can possibly imagine, this sort of stuff. So really interesting insights. I'm not going to come into a podcast and say this is what is happening in Russia, but it did surprise me how there was this undercurrent of angst and dissent, which isn't able to give vent properly. As you know, Russia is a surveillance state. You can get in an awful lot of trouble, prison even, if you publicly go around and protest against the war or talk against the war. So even finding these kernels of criticism is important. And I have to say as well, Francis, this is an important point. This criticism of Putin and the war wasn't just coming from like young hipsters in bars. This was a range of ages and different groups of people, older people who were not particularly well off. I can't give too many details away, not particularly well off, to relatively middle class Russians I spoke to on the street, to the younger groups. So really interesting insight and a very important story to tell, worth the trip, worth the relative risk, which I think were relatively low, but you're never quite sure.
Well, thank you, James, for that really interesting perspective. You mentioned it being a surveillance state, of course. I've got to ask about a story you reference in the article, which is you playing chess with an FSB officer. You've got to spill the beans, James.
Where to start? So this was an entirely accidental game of chess. I'm a keen chess player, not so good, but keen enough. 10 days ago on a Saturday, I had a long wait for my flight back from Kazan to Istanbul, and I was chatting to a couple in a central Kazan square overlooked by a statue of Lenin. And we were talking about a plaque on the wall. There's lots of plaques on these walls in Russia about a famous local sportsman, etc. And they said, well, if you're interested in plaques, walk around the corner, and there's a really great one around the corner. So I was like, fine, I'll do that. Walk around the corner, and then I realised I was walking down a street with this very large building set back from the road with mirrored windows and behind a railing fence. And I realised that was the local FSB headquarters. So I quickened my pace, turned the corner, and was walking away from it. I thought, don't want to hang around here too long. And I saw a coffee shop, and I thought, well, actually, I could really do with a cup of coffee. Walked in, was speaking to the lady making the coffee in Russian, and then this Russian guy behind me, a sharply dressed Russian guy, started speaking to me in English. And I think he was just intrigued about what I was doing there. And he said, come and have a cigarette outside and coffee with me. So I went, chatted with him outside for a bit, switching between English and Russian. And then he said, do you want to play a game of chess? Chess, as you know, in Russia is a national game. There are people playing chess, totally ordinary thing to do, more so than in England. And there were other couples playing chess, hunched over chess sets in this coffee shop. So I said, yeah, absolutely, let's play a game of chess. I sat down, introduced myself, said to him what I was doing there. And then he introduced himself and said, I work in security, but I can't tell anything anymore because it's a secret. And at that moment, too late, I put two and two together, and I was like, okay, this is clearly a coffee shop where the Russian security services have their coffee breaks. So we played this game of chess, felt my senses more heightened than usual. I wanted to win it, and luckily I did win it. And then very graciously, this Russian security services guy resigned and said, well played, and that was the end of it. It was a thrill, but it was all an accident as well.
Well, thanks very much for that, James. As I said earlier on, the world waits with bated breath to see what the results are in the United States election today. We will be covering it very extensively over the coming days as we learn more. But at the moment, there's no point in us speculating about polls or anything else because we simply don't know. I've read pieces that say that it's inevitable that Trump will win, and I've seen polls that say likewise for Kamala Harris. So we will see, but stick with us as we digest the results and its ramifications for the United States and indeed the wider world this week. But let's go to our final thoughts now. Before I go to Dom and James, a lighter story from last week that I just want to mention. Just when you thought Moscow couldn't stoop any lower, they're coming for our cheese. So this is a story from London where truckles of Welsh cheddar were among a £300,000 heist, incredible use of the word there, of cheese stolen in a scam in what's believed to have been a sophisticated con which saw cheese stolen and then shipped to Russia. So the Met Police is investigating, and Neal's Yard Dairy is said to be working with international authorities. I don't know if they specialise in cheese or if that's just a special, like Interpol or something, to try and identify the scammers. It's a special dairy dealing with high-value award-winning cheeses, including Westcombe and Pitchfork, and are sold as much as £45 per kilogram. And apparently the fraudsters posed as agents of a French supermarket in order to receive the 22 tonnes of cloth-bound cheeses from this Southwark-based company without paying for it. Now, I must confess, I'm rather suspicious here, not because it may be some new tactic of hybrid warfare, but because on the date in question, Dom was away from Telegraph Towers. Is there anything that you want to confess, Dom?
Well, what does a cheese say to itself each morning when it's brushing its teeth in the mirror? Hello, me.
Cutting edge reporting there. Dom, do you want to go next for final thoughts before we go to James?
Yes, I think we better had. My final thoughts, two of my favourite things, Australia and rugby. So a really interesting story in The Economist you'll be able to find online. Probably, I'm not sure if it's in this week's newspaper, but anyway, it's online, talking about defence diplomacy. So Australia, very concerned about increasing Chinese security interests in the region, in particular Papua New Guinea, just to the north of Queensland. Go to Queensland, go to the pointy bit, keep going, swim a bit, then you get there, avoid the sharks. So China has signed trade and tech agreements with Papua New Guinea. It's pushing for various deals on policing and other security interests. This comes on the back of other security deals China has signed with Pacific nations such as the Solomon Islands in 2022. So Australia has a plan, the economists say, to keep Chinese forces out of Papua New Guinea. The paper says this involves, well, back to the calendar really, beefy men bashing into each other. So Papua New Guinea has long wanted its own team in Australia's National Rugby League, and the Australian government has committed 600 million Australian dollars, that's just over 400 million US dollars, over the next 10 years to set up a team in PNG. Now, in return, it's thought they're going to demand assurances that Papua New Guinea is not going to sign any agreements that would allow Chinese police or military forces to be based there. That comes from, or the Economist quoting ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. So interesting use of defence diplomacy. Something for everyone there. Francis, bit of rugby, bit of beefy men, right up your Strasser, mein Freund.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dom. James Kilner.
So, yeah, you've got me thinking again, Francis, about this delicious game of chess I had in Kazan and my tussle with this Russian security agent and the long end game we played out. But aside from that, I do think today's statement from Peskov regarding the Moldovan election is a really important one. The Kremlin basically officially saying that it doesn't recognize Sandu as the sort of elected leader of Moldova is signal that they're going to intensify their manipulation campaign in Moldova. As Dom said, the Kremlin used the data which said that inside Moldova itself, Sandu won less votes than her pro-Russia opponent. So that is definitely something to watch out for. I'm just finishing up a story for the website, Telegraph website, about Russian forces again accelerating, intensifying their attacks on the front line, apparently seemingly coinciding with the US election. The UK Ministry of Defence put out a statement today saying that in some places along the front line in the past week, the Russian forces have advanced by 9 kilometres, which is actually very speedy. So please watch out for that.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we're relying on your support more than ever. You can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter, now X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.